The screen flashes. Logos of US Steel and Nippon Steel hover over grainy footage of shuttered factories and silent assembly lines. On the surface, it was a simple transaction, a $14 billion acquisition, Japan's Nippon Steel buying an American icon. Promises were made, jobs would stay, Pittsburgh would remain the heart of operations. It was marketed as a partnership. But behind the polished headlines, a much larger tremor was forming. Thousands of miles away, President Trump signed an executive order to double tariffs on imported steel and aluminum to 50%. Steel markets across Asia reacted instantly, with stocks plummeting by 3% to 5% overnight. Factories in China braced for impact. And this was just the beginning. At first, the headlines were triumphant. Nippon Steel's takeover of US Steel was framed as a strategic alliance, not a hostile acquisition. American politicians celebrated the deal, with promises that no jobs would be lost and the iconic Pittsburgh headquarters would remain untouched. The agreement even included a unique safeguard, a golden share, giving the US government veto power over critical decisions. It was billed as a victory for American industry. Meanwhile, in the West Wing, another decision was taking shape. President Trump, riding a wave of economic nationalism, signed an executive order that doubled tariffs on imported steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%. Markets recoiled. Steel stocks across Asia fell sharply, losing 3% to 5% of their value overnight. In China, steel mills were already under pressure, operating at surplus levels rarely seen before. Now, the sudden tariff surge threatened to choke off their largest export markets. Inside workshops from Hebei to Jiangsu, workers whispered of layoffs and reduced shifts. A quiet panic set in. But here's what no one said out loud. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was the opening move in an economic war with no clear end. China's steel industry has long been the foundation of its industrial ascent. For decades, the formula remains simple: produce more, export more. In 2024 alone, China's steel exports surged 36% year-over-year, flooding global markets with surplus supply. Domestic demand could no longer absorb the volume. Steel mills leaned heavily on overseas buyers to clear their inventories. But when the US doubled tariffs, a vital artery was cut. Steel prices across Asia tumbled. Warehouses overflowed with unsold products. Producers, desperate to survive, slashed prices, triggering a brutal race to the bottom. Meanwhile, state-run media in Beijing broadcast calm assurances. The government would stabilize the market, they said. Behind closed doors, executives weren't so certain. Production lines slowed. Expansion projects were shelved. Factories that once ran 24/7 began to go dark. It wasn't just about steel anymore. It was the first crack in a structure once thought unshakable. Across the industrial heartlands of China, the shockwaves turned personal. In Hebei province, known as the steel capital, workers clustered around factory gates, scanning bulletin boards for news. Shift cuts turned into layoffs. Analysts speculate that unemployment in China's steel sector could rise by 12% by the end of 2025. For thousands of families, a sudden silence replaced the hum of production. Local diners lost their lunchtime crowds. School attendance dropped as families prepared to move away. It wasn't just jobs vanishing. Entire communities, once thriving, stood on the brink of collapse. Supply truck drivers parked their rigs indefinitely. Corner stores padlocked their doors. The steel mills weren't just industries, they were lifelines, and now those lifelines were fraying. The question wasn't if more closures would come, it was how soon. The summer of 2025, the cracks had widened into deep fractures. Across China's industrial belt, the dominoes began to fall. Steel factories, once symbols of national pride, shuttered operations one after another. Small and mid-sized firms folded under mounting losses, unable to weather the storm. The local press dubbed it the Great Steel Collapse, a wave of bankruptcies that engulfed towns built entirely around steel. Workers, once promised stability, now stood in unemployment lines. Entire communities withered, schools closed, shops were abandoned. Steel inventories had ballooned far beyond domestic demand, with no foreign markets left to absorb the surplus. Credit dried up. Banks, wary of escalating defaults, tightened lending, choking off what little oxygen remained. Local governments, heavily indebted and under strain, could no longer prop up failing industries. Desperation seeped into every corner. In Hebei's industrial towns, residents dismantled idle machinery for scrap. In Shandong, unpaid workers staged protests, some clashing with local authorities. The government announced fresh subsidies, but the damage was already done. Faith, not just in the market, but in the system itself, began to erode. As one laid-off worker said, staring at the rusted gates of a closed factory, "We were told steel would build the future. Now it's just building ruins." For them, steel wasn't just a commodity. It was identity, legacy, survival. And now, it was all slipping away. The collapse wasn't sudden. It had been building for years, hidden beneath polished GDP figures and government press releases. China's steel industry was never about market demand. It was about output quotas, political prestige, and the illusion of endless growth. In 2024, overproduction had already reached 1.2 billion metric tons, far exceeding domestic consumption. For decades, Beijing had used heavy industries like steel to fuel rapid GDP growth. More steel meant more infrastructure, more jobs, more propaganda victories. But that model relied on one assumption: the world would always buy. When tariffs closed off foreign markets, the contradictions surfaced. Overcapacity became unmanageable. Local officials, judged by growth targets, had no incentive to cut production. Banks, pressured by political mandates, kept lending to failing mills. By 2025, non-performing loans in the steel sector surged by 19%. The system was addicted to expansion, even when it no longer made economic sense. What collapsed wasn't just the market, it was the very logic that underpinned China's industrial ascent. Behind every empty factory stood a deeper truth. This was not a crisis of steel. It was a crisis of a model that had run out of road. 7. Reflection. The abandoned mills tell a silent story. Rusting gates, broken windows, empty towns. For decades, China's rise was measured in tons of steel poured, miles of highways laid, cities built overnight. But at what cost? When the last furnace goes cold, what remains? Just economic waste, or the remnants of a dream deferred? And the deeper question lingers. If growth at all costs built this world, what happens when the cost becomes too high?